My metal smells like burned fat. They polish it for parades with a solvent that never quite kills the stink. It lives in the seams, a sweet, rancid ghost that clings to the brass like a confession. I wear it on the right side of my flak, because that's the side the picked thralls like best when they pan across the ranks. They call it a citation for valor. I call it what it is, a receipt. It proves I bought a line of trench with the lives of men who took orders from me and never came back for change. They told us Vardek IX was an agri-moon. Wheat to the horizon, manufactura set like teeth along irrigation rivers. A Munitorum boon if we kept it out of the orc jaws snapping in from the rimward drift. That was the brief. We landed to the color of smoke. The fields were ash, the rivers were slurry, and the manufactura had turned their chimneys into artillery, coughing slag shells into the low cloud, until the air itself felt as if it was being loaded and fired. The first thing I tasted was Prometheum rain. The second thing I tasted was someone else's blood. They assigned me a platoon of replacements who still smelled like void ship air and recited the catechisms of readiness as if prayer could thicken armor. I had my old auspex with the cracked glass, a pattern you can't requisition anymore because the binaric hymn that wakes its machine spirit is technically heretical. It hisses in a way I trust. I trust it because it has never lied to me and because it hisses like a wounded thing, and everything wounded in this galaxy has learned the truth. We took our first foxhole under a harvest processor that had folded in half over the roadway, its reaper arms stuck up like ribs. The road was white with pulverized bone meal that blew in gusts and salted our lips. I told them to keep their heads down, and they did, even when the first green rounds came stitching through the wreckage, even when the second volley found Private Joral's neck and turned his vox grill into a fluted whistle that gurgled my name. I answered anyway. I told him I was there. You say it even when you're not. You say it because the lie plugs a hole for as long as it takes the blood to run out. Command called the line stable by midnight. Stable meaning both sides were bleeding at the same rate and the Administratum could do the math. Stable meaning we'd achieved the kind of balance that eats men like a tide, eats sandcastle Sony grain at a time, elegantly, until the map says beach again. We received a data slate listing the next day's objectives, and the slate listed us like items. Platoon 17, advance 120 meters under suppressive fire, secure the spool yard, deny the enemy the use of the rail. The slate didn't list what we would pay. It never does. That accounting happens in the dark, in the place where the Munitorum keeps its abacuses of human lives, clicking little teeth against the green felt of the Imperium's mouth. The spool yard had once fed cable to a web of conveyors that tied the manufactura to the fields and the fields back to the sky. When we reached it, the orcs had dug in under the spools. They were laughing. They laugh when they're shot. They laugh when they're dying. I sometimes think they laugh at all the things we call meaning. I threw a tube of smoke and a prayer into the same arc. One blossomed silver, the other died unheard. We went in under the leftmost reel, and the first thing I saw beneath was paintred daubed in greasy handprints around a gun welded out of insults to physics and nailed to a frame of plundered iron. They had fed it with faith and spite. It worked because they believed it would. We took it with grenades and hate, and when the smoke cleared, Trooper Hale was missing his left arm and laughing like an orc. Blood made his teeth shine. I told him he could laugh when we'd taken the yard. He kept laughing. I don't think he could stop. By dusk, the air was full of ash gnats that crawled into the wound seams of our flak and laid little black eggs that hatched into itch. We burned them out with elho embers and pretended it was a game. You can make a game of anything if you keep the rules simple enough. The orcs kept theirs very simple. They came at last light with a roar that made the soil shiver. We shot the front ranks down, and the ranks behind climbed the heap and kept coming. I remember a knob with a jaw like a vice, a brand of someone's skull stamped into his shoulder, his chopper scratched with prayers to Gork or Mork. He swung at me and I parried with my lasgun as if a strip of wood could argue. It didn't, but Sergeant Khan did, arriving from my right with a bayonet that said no in a language everyone understood. The knob took the bayonet, took Khan's second stab, took my lasbolt to the eye, and then my fifth to the soft spot above the tusk. He fell at my boots, and his laugh coughed out 3 thick syllables that could have been a curse or a joke. We held. The picked thralls later cut that engagement into footage with a victorious march and a drumline. They cut before the part where I found Khan on his back, opening and closing his fist like he was trying to catch rain, saying the name of a hive child he'd never meet again. They decorated me the next morning. I went because an order is an order, and because the men needed to see something gleam in all that grey. The commissar pinned the brass into my flak, as if he were nailing a lid shut. He told the platoon that courage takes the shape of obedience, that obedience is the highest form of love a man can show to his species. I looked at their faces and saw boys who wanted to live. I looked past them and saw the Munitorum drums coughing black, and behind the drums I saw the Astartes shrine that the local governor had raised on the hill during the last tithe cycle. A little marble custodian standing forever at parade rest over a field that never was real. The statue stared at nothing and everything with that perfect, empty calm that only stone or saints possess. The wind blew. The metal smelled like burned fat. You think you get used to the arithmetic. You don't. You just learn how to move your hands faster over the beads. We took trenches the way the harvesters used to take grain, row after row, pushing the cutter through stalks of meat and bone because the schedule said today we reap. By the 5th day, the auspex told me there was a roar beneath the soil itself, a bass pulse like a buried heart. The orcs had tunneled under the old canal and were feeding bodies into the breach like coal. We sealed it with thermite and men who stayed on the wrong side because the charges needed hands that knew how to coax them into the correct song. I read their names off my slate, and then watched my slate accept an update that replaced the names with requisition numbers. The machine spirit does not care. The machine spirit cannot. Perhaps that is why we keep it. Perhaps that is why we envy it. I dreamed of terror that night. Not the real terror, not the seething stone nest that drinks 1,000 souls a day to keep its lighthouse burning, but the terror from the catechism plates they give you when you're very young. A blue sky, a palace that looks like a cathedral made of light. I woke with my tongue bleeding where I'd bitten it. The wind carried the taste of iron from the blown-out manufactura down the trenches. It tasted like the waking world was trying to make a promise it couldn't keep. On the 7th day, a Skitarii maniple passed our line. They moved at a pace that had nothing to do with human cadence, a series of accelerations and controlled stutters like a prayer put into legs. Their visors were dark. They smelled like machine oil and wet stone. Their alpha glanced at me as if I were an environmental hazard to be measured or avoided. Behind them clattered a servitor dragging a trolley of ammunition, knuckles leaving little crescents in the dust each time the road bucked it. I wanted to ask the alpha if he remembered being a man. I didn't. You don't ask the mechanicus questions that might require them to answer. We were told to hold our fire at dusk. Command dreamed of something precise artillery set to cut a wheel of red through the orc line, while our platoons stepped behind it like dancers following a lantern through fog. The lantern turned into a storm. The first salvo overshot, catching the backline spanner wagons, and the second plowed into us. Shell fragments sang around my ears like a choir. Private Lysa lost her left cheek and a good portion of the words she used to say with it. We stuffed what was left of the words back into place and told her not to talk. She nodded, and I tried not to look at the ribbon of tongue that lay like a dead worm across her teeth. You may think this is cruelty. I tell it because it happened. I tell it because the metal weighs more if you know what the weight is. I tell it because when the picked thralls cut the footage, they put a hymn underneath our advance and a lens flare across the moment I shot the knob with the jaw brand. And then they faded to the Aquila and a slogan about valor. That slogan was printed on the ration boxes the next day. We ate it. It tasted like paper. They sent us forward again on the 9th morning, through ash that had drifted knee-deep where the wind had stacked it, and through sections of trench that had filled with water from a pipe that broke singing in the night. That water shone. Oil does that. The orcs had planted banners in the marsh, glyphs daubed in blood that had gone brown. I told the men to keep their eyes off the banners. I told them the glyphs were not words, they were hooks, and that thought can catch. They nodded as if they believed me. I think they did. Faith is a tool. If you don't own it, it owns you. We reached the railhead. The rails were bent into smiles the length of streets, teeth missing, ties, shredded by shells and by claws. A loader crane lay across the platform, its arm driven through the roof of a hab block. I saw a little shrine in the loader's shadow, a saint of iron and wire bent by someone's hands into the suggestion of a woman. Someone had painted the wire with a child's nail lacquer that glowed like a wound. I wanted the saint to bless us. I wanted anything that could see us, to see us kindly. The orcs wanted us dead. Clear is better than kind. The push came at noon. It always does. They like the hours when the sun can watch. The first wave came laughing. The second came screaming. The third came with a drum made of a flayed barrel head and a boy's ribcage. We answered with fire. The last stutter sinks into you until you start to hear it when you breathe. It is something like a cough in the walls of your chest, the kind of cough you'd get from sleeping in damp stone and waking to frost on your blanket. I put the cough into the green. They fell. We fell. The line bent. I started speaking into the vox without words, just tone, the way you talk to a nervous animal so it doesn't bolt when the sky breaks. When the sky broke, it was not thunder. A shadow passed over the railhead and the ash lifted in a sheet. For a heartbeat I thought it might be salvation. The wings were the wrong shape. The descent was joyless. A Valkyrie howled in and vomited a squad of Kaskin into the platform's far edge. Black visors, armor that fit like truth, guns that do not cough but pronounce. They moved with a confidence we could not afford to remember. The orc lines hiccuped. We surged and bled and surged again, and then the Kaskin were gone into another fight and the noise came flooding back. Khan didn't make the second week. He miscounted a heartbeat in a grenade's fuse and paid with 2 fingers and a lung. He lived a day longer than the apothecary said he would because he'd promised me he'd finish the letter to his hive child. The letter said, "The world was beautiful in the mornings when the smoke lay down and you could see the bones of the manufacturer like a city in a painting." He asked that the child be told he saw the sun on the river one last time. He did not. The river had turned the color of rusted teeth, and it carried a film that clung to the edges of the barrels we dipped to wet our mouths. I sent the letter anyway. The truth is a luxury. You learn to spend it where it buys the most. You want numbers. You want to know what a victory costs. Here is a number. We started the fortnight with 42 souls on the slate. We ended it with 14.5. The half was Lysa, who kept her life and most of her face, and lost the ability to speak her father's name. She wrote it on the inside of her helmet, so she would not forget it was real. Here is another number. 3 manufactura still coughed on the horizon at dusk after the last push, and that meant we would receive another 1,000 men, and a prayer that the cogs would turn again in a month. Here is the number none of the slates show. 52,000 civilians on Vardek IX before the first drop. Here is the number I carved into the stock of my lasgun after the campaign. 9,000 at muster when the transports came. We call that a win. When the transports hovered down through air sweet with rot and victory, the picked thralls lined us up with our medals and filmed our broken teeth. They asked me to say something for the archive. I said the men had performed above expectation. I said the Emperor protects. I said the things you are supposed to say. My mouth moved and the words came out in the correct order. And at the end of it, the picked thrall lowered his lens and quietly asked me, off record, if I had family. I told him I had a name written on a helmet and a habit of waking when I don't want to. He nodded as if I'd given him a doctrine he could file. We loaded onto the transports with our receipts shining and our dead folded into the cargo racks like inventory. The commissar read the names. Some of them sounded wrong in his mouth, as if they were used to being spoken in softer rooms. I looked out through the slats as we lifted and saw the manufactura still burning. A single figure stood on the rail platform below us, a local in a coat stitched from 2 other coats, a bandage around one eye. He held a child on his hip. The child lifted a hand, and I lifted mine. Through the noise you cannot hear, I pretended we could. On the troop deck, the air was stale with the heat of the bodies and the oil of the weaponry and the solvent of the medals. The solvent stung the back of my throat the way a lie does when you tell it for someone else's sake. I took the medal off and laid it on my knee. Hale, who had kept his laughter and lost his arm, watched me with his good eye. "Going to throw it?" he asked, and his voice made a sound where the missing teeth interrupted the word. "No," I said, and pinned it back on. "It belongs to them." I did not say who I meant. He knew. The transport shuddered as the pilot took us through a curtain of heated air that had once been a roof. I closed my eyes, which is a habit I tell myself I do not have, and saw the loader's wire saint again, and the nail lacquer that made her glow, and the way the ash clung to the edges of her feet, as if even the dust wanted someone to bless. We did not go to rest. We never do. The orders were waiting when the landing stilts groaned under the weight of the transport, and the ramp dropped to show us a sky the color of old paper. We received the brief in a shed that smelled of mildew and machine spirits. New world, new line, new arithmetic. The Munitorum cogitators had spat our regiment into another column on another slate, and our receipt would be needed there, and the promise we had made with our breath on Vardek IX had to be honored again in a place I had never heard of, until the moment the name cut my ear. If there is the secret to survival in the Guard, it is this: you find ways to carry the dead that do not break your spine. The first time you try, you use memory, and that fails you because memory grows heavy and the straps cut. After that, you learn to carry them in small pieces. A habit, a joke, a ritual. Khan's way of tapping the flak over his heart twice before he stood. Lysa's habit of scratching a tally on the inside of her palm for every sunrise she got to see. Hale's laugh, which I used to hate, and now keep like a talisman against quiet. You keep these. You pin them where the metal goes. You learn which weight makes you stand straighter and which makes you fold. You never let go of all of it. You never take all of it at once. On the second night in transit, the Emperor found me. Or I dreamed he did. Or I told myself a story and dressed it in the only clothes that fit. The deck hummed, the way metal hums when it is tired, and I lay on my back and watched a crack in the overhead bulkhead, as if it were a map. The hum deepened until it felt like a hand pressed against my chest. A voice came under the hum, not words, not anything the vox could pick up, just a pressure that arranged my thoughts into a shape. It felt like standing before the statue on Vardek's hill and wanting it to look down. It felt like being 9 years old in a Manufactorum hab and seeing the Ecclesiarchy Pict of Terror for the first time and thinking light was something a man could touch. The voice said nothing. It did not need to. I reached for it anyway, because we are creatures who reach. My hand touched the crack in the bulkhead and came away black with oil. I wiped it on my flak and made a smudge where the metal sits. The smudge never quite came out. We dropped into Atelia Theta under an orange sun that looked like a wound that had forgotten how to close. The world was all ridges and valleys, trenches already cut by a war older than our orders, the soil, a flower that got into your nose and made everything smell like old books. The orcs were gone here. Something else had the ground. We learned its name from a screaming man whose uniform still had the aquila on it, but not much else a man can keep. Tyranids change the arithmetic. They do not laugh. They do not bargain. They do not care about banners. They come like the hum under the deck, like a pressure that shapes the shape of the day and decides what is meat and what is not. We built a line where the last men had failed to build theirs. We stacked ammunition where the last men had stacked their dead. We prayed in a circle not because it changes the world, but because it changes the faces of men in a way that lets them look at the world again. I spoke the catechism and left out the part that says, "Our suffering is joy." I cannot make my mouth form that lie. The commissar did not hear me leave it out. He heard the rhythm and called it obedience. Rhythm will fool the ear. It is one of the earliest deceptions a child learns, before speech, before the first time you are told to stand and do. At dusk, the sky boiled. The forward auspex began to scream in a register, the machine spirit reserves for the things it considers an insult to counting. We saw the first of them crest the ridge with their bodies held by an idea that is not gravity. The line fired. The last coughed. The bolters spoke. The ground received. I felt the old rhythm come back into my hands, and I hated it and I needed it. I put the cough into the chitin and the chitin split, and the meat underneath had no name worth keeping. Lysa stood on the berm and wrote the word father inside her helmet again, over and over, even though the sweat had made the earlier ink run. Hale laughed, which is what he does when he wants the world to hear that he still can. We held the first night because the sun fell faster than their hunger. We held the second because the hive had not yet found the song that would unmake us. We held the third because the artillery remembered how to walk its fire without stepping on our toes. We do not call that luck. We call it practice, which is a thinner word and less inclined to betray you. On the fourth night, the commissar found me sitting on the edge of the berm with my boots in the dust and asked me to explain to the fresh troopers what victory is. He wanted the speech that pins brass into a line of faces and makes the solvent smell like a promise. I told them, victory is a number that lets the Administratum sleep. I told them victory is a ledger that closes on the right side of the page. I told them victory is a child who still has a mother in the morning. The commissar frowned, and then he nodded, and for a moment I saw a man behind the cap. In the witching hour, the vox carried whispers it shouldn't have. The tyrannid chitter bled into our net, scrapes and clicks that turned into syllables where the wire sagged. I have heard daemons speak through static. This was not that. This was an ocean talking, in its sleep. It said nothing to me and everything to the part of my brain that counts. I looked down the line and saw men counting their breaths. 10 in, 10 out, 10 till a shell falls, 10 till the sun erupts, 10 till the order, 10 till the medal, 10 till the box. It is a faith like any other and more honest than most. I counted with them, and in the counting I felt the shape of a word that might be the Emperor's, or might just be the sound a wounded world makes when it tries to rest. When dawn came, the sun bled through a veil of spores and painted the trench the color of old bruises. I could smell the hive now, a sweetness that made bile sting my teeth. I do not want to talk about the push that day, but I will. You did not come here to be spared. They broke our left. They broke the place where a boy who should have been replacing a pressure seal on a water main in some hive had been told to stand and hold. He held. The line did not. We went into the gap because you don't leave a door open when the dark is full of teeth. We went in and the world became a yard wide and 30 meters long, and the only things that mattered lived inside it and had my men's names. I burned the last charge pack and threw the pack and drew the knife, and afterward I could not open my right hand for an hour. When it opened with a little sound like a hinge that has forgotten oil. We held. They call that a win. They will pin me another piece of brass and bathe it in solvent that cannot clean what it promises to clean. And they will film my face and put a hymn under it and cut before the part where I vomit behind the berm because the hive's sweetness got in through my nose and told my stomach a lie. They will ship the footage to a world that has never smelled promethium in the rain. A child will watch it and decide to be a hero. His mother will cry while he signs the tithe parchment. The Administratum will sleep. The ledger will close. The line will hold. If you ask me why I keep stepping forward when the order says forward, I will tell you this. I have learned to keep the dead in pieces small enough for a man to lift. I have learned there is a kind of love that can only be measured by the things you stand in front of. I have learned that the Emperor's light is real enough to burn a path through hell if men are willing to set themselves like candles along it and accept that wax was always the plan. I do not know if he speaks. I do not know if he hears. I do know that when I press my palm against the flak over my heart twice, the way Khan did, I can feel a rhythm that is not just mine, not just the transport's deck, not just the artillery's cough, but something like a hand on the inside of the world. We will move again at dusk. The Auspex says the hum is rising. Lysa has new ink. Hale's laugh sounds more like breath now, and I think that is an improvement. I have polished the metal and left the smudge where the oil stained my flak. I keep the wire saint in my pocket. I do not know when I took her. I do not believe in theft, but I believe in relics you can close your hand around when the sky forgets men. If she belonged to someone, she still does. We belong to each other, the living and the dead, the ones with names and the ones who carry them, the ones who count and the ones who are counted. The commissar is coming down the trench. The vox is coughing orders. The sun is lifting its bruised face. There will be ash gnats tonight. There will be solvent on brass. There will be a ledger that closes and a child who maybe sees a morning. I will stand. I will go. And when I come back, if I come back, I will sit on the berm with my boots in the dust and tell you exactly how much the next 100 meters cost. The cost, as always, was counted in silence first. Silence before the barrage. Silence before the order that climbs down the Vox like a sermon wearing the wrong skin. Silence that presses into your ears until you start to think you can hear the planet itself drawing breath before it screams again. I remember the first shell of that evening, not because it was loud, they all are, but because it carried light that looked wrong. Blue-white, like the inside of a cogitator core when you open it without reciting the binding verse. The explosion didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like a cathedral's choir collapsing. Dirt rained on us in sheets that smelled of ozone and mold, and something almost sweet tyrannid ichor boiling in the craters. The commissar yelled orders through the din, his Vox grill crackling, his voice half prayer, half command. We moved. The world moved with us. The sky turned into a sieve through which light and fire and shards of sound poured without restraint. When we reached the new forward ridge, the ground was moving. Not metaphorically, it was breathing. The hive had exhaled spores so thick the earth pulsed like muscle. Our boots sank in, and every step made a wet sigh. The auspex told us there was life everywhere, but it couldn't tell where it ended, and we began. "Hold here," I said. The words came out hoarse, scraped raw from the smoke. Hale nodded, set the heavy stubber, and kissed the side of its casing like a priest blessing an altar. Lysa crouched beside him, helmet tucked under her arm, lips moving. She wasn't praying. She was writing again on the inside, etching words into the shell with the stub of a graphite stick she kept for that purpose. Then the first wave hit. You don't forget the sound of a tyrannid wave. It's not a roar, not really. It's two-layered, like the ocean dragging glass across stone, like 1,000 insects dreaming the same nightmare. The first forms broke over the ridge, smaller gaunts with limbs like hooked knives. We burned them down. The smell was copper and vinegar and death. They fell into the spore pits and boiled, feeding the ground that tried to eat our boots. Command said it was a containment, engagement. That phrase means the same thing it always means. We die slowly enough for the next regiment to arrive in time to do it again. The Vox kept repeating the phrase until even the static seemed to chant it. We held through the night. The barrel of my lasgun glowed dull red. The charge pack indicator blinked its final warning. I switched to bayonet work. The skin of the gaunts was slick. My hands slipped more than they should have. Hale's laughter was gone now, replaced by the grunt of someone counting under his breath. At some point, I realized the ridge beneath us wasn't Earth anymore. The spore mass had solidified, a crust over something that twitched. The planet was digesting us in slow motion. I drove my bayonet into the ground and felt it slide through a membrane. Warmth pulsed up the hilt. I left it there. I didn't want to know what would happen if I pulled it out. When dawn bled in, if you can call that jaundiced smear dawn, the world was quiet again. Hale had gone still, his stubber silent, a hole the size of a fist in his chest, where something too fast to see had passed through. I closed his eye, because the other one was gone, and left the stubber where it sat. Lysa didn't cry. She just wrote Hale inside her helmet next to Father. I radioed the position. The reply came hours later, distorted, but the words were clear enough. Hold. Reinforcements en route. They never specify from where. Reinforcements are a myth told between volleys. By the third day, the ridge had stopped breathing, and we could hear engines to the west, Imperial armor, the sound of faith with treads, Lehman Russ squadrons rolling like thunder given shape. When they crested the horizon, the dust plumes caught the sun, and for a moment, I thought it was hope. It wasn't. They fired into the ridge, through us, through everything, because that was the order. I saw the commissar's mouth move, but the Vox drowned him. The shells hit the hive nodes, burrowed beneath us, and the ground opened. I remember falling not far, just enough to lose which way was up. I remember grabbing Lysa's arm and her hand slipping free. I woke to dark. The air was thick and warm, the kind of dark you can smell. I could hear movement above metal grinding on bone. My lasgun was gone, my helmet cracked. The Vox whispered names I didn't know. Then a light bloomed, not white, not red, a sick green, phosphor bright, cutting through the dark like truth through prayer. Necrons, the first I'd ever seen. The Auspex called them unknown hostiles, but every instinct screamed ancient. They moved with the precision of forgotten machinery, silent, efficient. The Tyrannid remnants swarmed them, and the Necrons carved through the tide with weapons that turned flesh into dust. The air shimmered with energy discharges that smelled of ozone and history. I crawled behind a slab of stone. No, not stone, something older, carved with symbols that looked like mathematics had learned to bleed. The Necrons ignored me. I was beneath their notice, a mayfly hiding under a god's shadow. One of them paused, turned its skull toward me. Its eyes burned like captured suns. For a moment, I thought it might end me. It didn't. It just stared, and in that blank gaze I saw eternity stripped of purpose. Then it moved on, firing into the dark. When the guns fell silent, I was alone again. The ridge was gone, replaced by glass. Lysa was nowhere. The Vox whispered her name once, then fell silent too. I climbed until I saw sky again. The armor regiments were gone. The Tyranids were gone. The Necrons had left nothing but lines of fused earth like scars across the land. The war had moved on without us. It always does. The Administratum would mark the sector stabilized, and the Munitorum would requisition fresh recruits to fill the numbers. Victory declared. Another ledger closed. I walked for 2 days through silence. Found a Hab ruin half buried in slag. Inside, a shrine half melted, half intact. An image of the Emperor, face blackened, eyes still shining through soot. I knelt, not to pray, but because my knees gave out. The floor was covered in ash, and when I touched it, it was warm, like someone had just left. A servo skull floated in from a broken archway, Vox speaker clicking. Guardsman, State Designation, 17th Platoon, Vardek IX, I said out of reflex. It hovered closer. Vardek IX recorded, concluded. Casualty total, complete. Commendations archived. You are deceased. I laughed, and the sound echoed too loudly. Then what am I? Data anomaly, it said. And turned away. I followed it out of the ruin. The thing led me across the glass plains to a drop site where a Munitorum detachment had already established a new base. They scanned me. They stamped me. They issued new gear. To them, I was another body to be slotted into the great machine. My file read, Veteran, redeployable, prior, honors confirmed, cleared for service. They never asked about Hale or Lysa. They never asked about the Necrons. They just handed me a new lasgun and told me to report to Command Tent Gamma 7 before nightfall. The tent smelled of incense and ink. A scribe sat behind a desk, eyes augmetic, hands stained with data ink. He didn't look up. Name? Doesn't matter, I said. He tapped a rune. Everything matters. In the Emperor's ledger, all things are recorded. I looked at the parchment before him. Names in neat columns. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Lines through some. Marks beside others. Lives reduced to checkboxes. And what happens to the ones you strike through? He finally looked up. The augmetic eyes focused on me with mechanical precision. They are accounted for. That is enough. I left before he could ask more questions. The sky outside had turned violet, streaked with the contrails of departing ships. Somewhere above, new regiments were descending, fresh faces ready to die for coordinates they couldn't pronounce. That night, I couldn't sleep. The glass under my bedroll creaked when the wind shifted, and I thought I could hear the dead whispering through it. Not words, just a pressure, like the hum beneath the transport deck again. I went outside. The horizon glowed faintly where the manufactura burned. In the distance, I saw a column of troopers marching into the dark. No songs, no banners, just the rhythm of boots. I joined them without thinking. No one asked who I was. No one cared. We all looked the same under the dust. We marched until dawn. Then the order came. New war zone, new ledger, new arithmetic. When the first shells fell, I didn't even flinch. The ground shook like an old friend waking. I raised my lasgun, sighted down the barrel, and waited for the shapes to emerge from the smoke. They did. Human this time, traitors, heretics, men wearing the same flak but painted with 8-pointed stars. I shot them without hesitation. Maybe one of them had worn a medal like mine once. Maybe he'd believed in something before the warp took it apart. I'll never know. By nightfall, the line held. The Vox said the word victory again. It sounded the same as loss. I think about Hale's laughter sometimes, about Lysa's helmet with its inked words, about Khan's letter. The Administratum would say they served the Emperor faithfully. I think they served each other. I think that's closer to truth. The medal they gave me after this battle was different, heavier. New inscription, for the Emperor's light, given freely. I almost laughed. Nothing we give is free. The Imperium takes everything, blood, breath, thought, and calls it duty. We give because there's nothing left to withhold. But maybe that's the point. Sometimes, in the silence between barrages, I think I can still hear the hum, the one that found me on the transport. Maybe it's the Emperor's voice. Maybe it's just the universe counting. Either way, it keeps time. And I march to it, because stopping means being forgotten. They'll send me to another front soon. They always do. Each one feels the same, a new planet that smells like old death, a new enemy that believes it's the first to hate us. Maybe one day the math will stop working. Maybe one day there won't be enough of us left to fill the ledgers. Until then, I'll polish the medal. I'll keep the wire saint in my pocket. I'll press my hand twice to my chest and tell myself it's for them. Khan, Hale, Lysa, all the names the servo skull called anomalies. And when the picked thralls ask for my statement, I'll give them the only truth I have left. We held. They call it rest between campaigns, but there is no rest. Only the spaces where the screams take a breath. We were quartered in the ruins of what had once been a cathedral manufactorum, a place where saints and ammunition were both assembled, each blessed, each expendable. The walls still wore their stained glass, cracked but not entirely broken. When the wind came through the holes, the fragments of color crawled across the floor like dying light. I slept beneath a mural of St. Drusus, the light of dawn bisecting his face, one side martyr, one side shadow. Someone had etched graffiti into the stone below his feet. We live long enough to die again. The food came in ration bricks stamped with the aquila. They tasted like dust and confession. I ate anyway. Hunger is an order you can't disobey. Around me, the men of the regiment tried to remember what it meant to be human. One played a harmonica made from shell-casing brass. Another carved small figures from ration crates, crude saints with missing limbs. A few sat in silence, staring at the ashes that drifted through the window like snow. I envied them their stillness. Every night the commissar walked the aisles between us, whispering verses. He believed if he could keep the rhythm of obedience alive, we would not forget our place in the Emperor's design. I believed something different, that we needed silence more than words. Silence makes space for ghosts. Hale's laugh still echoed in the cracks between thoughts. Khan's cough before the charge. Lysa's voices soft, deliberate, like she was building words one careful brick at a time. Sometimes I thought I heard her behind me. When I turned, there was only dust moving in the lamplight. The next morning, the orders came in. New planet, new theater. Hive world designation, Raxus Secundus. Population, billions. Status, contested. The enemy humans again, this time calling themselves the Free Congregation of the Ninefold Path. Heretics, dressed in faith. We were to reclaim the Hive's core manufactura and purge the apostates. The shuttle ride down burned the atmosphere into colors I'd never seen. Through the port, the Hive rose like a mountain of knives, spires breaking the clouds, lights bleeding through the smog like wounds that refused to close. Vox chatter filled the cabin, fragments of prayers, coordinates, death codes. When the ramp dropped, heat hit like a wall. The city's underhive smelled of oil, burnt paper, and rot. The light came in stripes through vents overhead. Shadows moved in every direction, and each shadow had a gun. We advanced through corridors where statues of saints watched from alcoves, their faces worn smooth by centuries of smoke. Somewhere deep below, machinery throbbed with the heartbeat of industry gone mad. The heretics attacked from above, descending like broken angels from gantries and bridges, robes flaring, stubbers barking. They screamed praises to something that answered back through the vox in static that felt alive. We answered with lasfire and faith. Faith is a funny thing in the Guard. It isn't hope, it isn't belief. It's momentum, the refusal to stop even when stopping would make sense. We cleared 6 levels in 12 hours. The floors were slick with blood. The heat baked it into the air until breathing felt like swallowing rust. My eyes burned. My hands shook. Still, the line moved forward. When we reached the Manufactorum's central chamber, I saw what they'd been worshipping. A great machine, once used to shape armor plates, now twisted into a shrine. They'd welded flesh into its joints, human and not, and every piston stroke drew blood from the walls. Above it hung the remains of a servitor whose torso had been carved into a pulpit. A preacher stood there, wrapped in wire and scripture, his voice amplified by the machine's lungs. "See how they forget you," he screamed. "See how they grind you into fuel for their god of gold." He wasn't wrong. That was the worst part. We shot him anyway. The machine screamed when he died. The floor buckled, the heat turned white, and then everything fell apart. I remember the ceiling folding, the air catching fire, the sound of steel, praying to die, then black. When I woke, I was half buried under rubble. My legs worked, my arms didn't, not properly. I could hear survivors calling out some familiar, most not. I pulled free, found a lasgun that wasn't mine, and dragged myself toward the light. Outside, the hive burned. Entire spires collapsed in waves, like candle wax melting under invisible fingers. Dropships screamed through the haze, dropping more men into the fire. The vox crackled. Victory achieved. The Manufactorum is secured. Secured. That word again. I looked at the ruin and laughed until I couldn't breathe. The decay tents filled faster than they could triage. Rows of bodies laid out under flickering lumen strips, their faces covered with tarps stamped with the aquila. Some still moved beneath the cloth. The priests moved among them, anointing foreheads with machine oil and whispering absolution to those who could no longer hear. A sister hospitaller took my name, then took my blood. She said I would live. I asked if that was good news. She didn't answer. I stayed in the tent for 3 days. On the second, a boy couldn't have been older than 16 died in the cot next to mine. His last words were, "Tell them we held. I promised I would." On the 3rd night, I dreamed of Lysa again. She was standing in a field of ash, holding her helmet. The words inside glowed like coals. She looked at me and said, "Stop counting." When I woke, the tent was empty, and my cot was covered in dust shaped like footprints. They reassigned me that morning. Different regiment, same war. When I reported to the new unit, the sergeant looked up from his data slate and smiled, not kindly, just the way a man smiles when he recognizes another piece of the same machine. "Veteran, huh?" Something like that. He handed me a new insignia, same symbol, different color. The paint still smelled fresh. That night, I sat on a stack of munition crates and polished the metal again. The oil smear had darkened into a stain. I thought about scraping it clean, but then I stopped. It reminded me that things which shine too bright can't be trusted. The next day, we deployed again. Open fields this time. Enemy unknown. The sky was clear, which is rare. It made me nervous. We dug in at the edge of a ravine. Across it, smoke rose in thin columns, the enemy lines, or maybe the bones of another regiment. It's hard to tell the difference after a while. The night before the offensive, I couldn't sleep. I walked the perimeter, listening to the hum of the power packs, the soft muttering of men praying into their palms. Then I heard it faint, almost swallowed by the wind. The same hum that had haunted me since Vardek IX. The same pulse that crawled under my ribs. I followed it to the edge of the ravine. There, half buried in the mud, was something I couldn't name. Metal but not mechanicus. Smooth, seamless, like it had been grown instead of forged. Symbols ran along its side, neither Imperial nor alien. Something older. It pulsed with light, soft and green, like the breath of a dying world. I reached out. My fingers brushed the surface, and for a moment, everything went quiet. No wind, no hum, no war, just silence. Then a voice, not in my ears, in my blood. Do you see it now? I pulled back, heart hammering. The thing flickered, then dimmed. I stumbled away. The next morning, the ravine was gone. A shell had found it in the night. The entire edge collapsed, taking the object and half the company with it. Command marked the loss as acceptable. We advanced anyway. The battle that followed was the kind that doesn't get remembered. Too small, too costly, too ordinary. The enemy broke first, but by then we were ghosts fighting ghosts. When the sun went down, I realized I hadn't reloaded in hours. There was no one left to shoot. They called it another victory. That night, while we waited for extraction, I sat alone in the dark and turned the wire saint over in my hands. The lacquer was gone, burned away. The metal was pitted and blackened, but the shape still held. I wondered if the Emperor ever looks down and sees us, really sees us. Not as pieces on a board, but as men who bleed and break and still stand up when the order comes. Maybe he does. Maybe that's why he never speaks. Maybe he's ashamed. When the dropship came, I climbed aboard without a word. The others slept, heads lolling, mouths open. The engines roared, and for a moment I thought I heard the hum again beneath the noise, steady, patient, eternal. I pressed my hand to my chest twice, like Khan used to, and whispered the only prayer that still makes sense. Let it mean something. The ship climbed. The war moved on. The next world didn't have a name, not one that mattered. The Administratum called it Designation 321 Delta, and the only reason anyone fought over it was because it existed between two places. Someone more important cared about. The Munitorum briefing said it had once been a mining moon, stripped and left hollow. The air was thin. The soil was glass. Nothing grew here except orders. We landed under the shadow of the fleet, and for a moment, the light of the engines turned the glass planes into mirrors. Thousands of reflections stared back, all of them wearing the same expression, obedience carved into flesh. Our boots cracked the surface as we marched. The sound echoed, hollow, like walking across the inside of a skull. Command told us this would be quick, no resistance expected. They lied, as they always do, but it wasn't malice, just habit. Lies are as necessary to the Imperium as oxygen. Without them, no one would breathe. We reached the old mining outpost by nightfall. The wind cut through us, carrying dust that glittered in the dark like ground bone. Inside the outpost, we found the previous garrison, or what was left of them. They hadn't been killed by any enemy I could name. Their armor was intact, their weapons charged, but their faces, what was left of them, were twisted into rictuses of awe or terror. It was hard to tell which. The Vox recorders had burned out, but one still played a fragment before the static swallowed it. We saw the light it was. Then nothing. The commissar ordered the bodies burned. The priests sang the litanies of purification while the smoke rose. I watched the flames dance across the glass and thought about the hum again. The same rhythm, the same pulse. Like something beneath the surface of the galaxy breathing in its sleep. That night, the stars flickered. Not the way stars do through bad atmosphere, this was something else. The constellations themselves seemed to move, rearranging like runes on a slate. The Vox went dead. The Auspex screamed. And then we saw it. Not an army, not even a ship. A shape in the sky, vast, angular, impossible. It hovered above the horizon, casting shadows that bent the wrong way. The tech priests said it was a Xenos artifact. The priests said it was a sign. The commissar said it didn't matter. All agreed it was beyond understanding. Orders came. Hold position. Observe. Await Mechanicus delegation. We dug in. Because digging is what we know. For 3 days it hung there, unmoving. Men began to hear things. Not voices exactly, but suggestions. Dreams of peace, dreams of release, dreams where the fighting stopped, and the emperor himself laid down his sword and smiled. The priests called it temptation. The decay called it fatigue. I called it mercy. On the 4th night, half the regiment walked into the desert. They left their weapons behind. No one stopped them. By morning they were gone. Not a track left in the glass. The commissar shot himself an hour later. No speech, no prayers. Just a single bolt round under the chin, like punctuation on a sentence he was tired of reading. We waited for orders. None came. The fleet above was silent. The Vox hissed, and whispered the same word again and again, too faint to be sure. Remember, by the 7th day, the air changed, thicker, heavy with the smell of rain, impossible rain, on a world that had none to give. Then the horizon glowed. The shape in the sky began to move. It descended slowly, without sound, until it hovered just above the plains. Light poured from its surface, green and gold, and wrong. The men dropped to their knees. I stayed standing. I don't know why. Maybe stubbornness is the last piece of humanity we're allowed to keep. The light washed over us, and for the first time in years, I felt warm. Not the heat of fire or promethium, but real warmth like the memory of a son that loved you. It hurt more than any wound. Images filled my head, not visions, memories, worlds I had never seen. Oceans that no longer existed, faces of people who looked at me like I mattered. The voice came back, not words, just meaning, like a hand closing over mine. You are remembered. Then, it was gone. The light, the warmth, the shape all vanished. The sky went back to black. The glass underfoot was cracked but solid. I looked around. Half the regiment was gone again. The others stared blankly at the sky, eyes reflecting nothing. The Auspex was dead. The Vox was silent. Only my pulse broke the quiet. When rescue came a week later, they called it a warp anomaly. They told us to forget. They gave us new orders, new weapons, new names. I didn't argue. Forgetting is a skill. You practice it long enough, and it starts to feel like obedience. Now I sit in another trench, on another world, waiting for another dawn that smells of blood and oil. The names change. The faces change. The wars never do. Sometimes I take the medal out and look at it. The brass has gone dull, the inscription almost worn away. I touch the black smear, the one that won't come off, and think of the shape in the sky, the warmth, the voice that said, "You are remembered." Maybe it was a trick of the warp. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was something else, something that saw what the Imperium refuses to. I asked a priest once, after a battle on Kestron Prime, whether he believed the Emperor still watches us. He said faith doesn't need sight. I asked him what happens if the Emperor stopped watching. He said that would be heresy. I told him I think we'd still march anyway. He didn't argue. There's a truth in that, the kind you can only earn by outliving your own fear. We march not because of orders, not because of faith. We march because stopping means admitting that the galaxy doesn't care whether we exist. And yet, when I look up at the stars, sometimes I see the constellations shift again, the same pattern as on the nameless moon, and I hear the hum faint, patient, eternal. It sounds almost like a heartbeat. Maybe it's the galaxy's. Maybe it's mine. We're told every guardsman dies in the Emperor's service, that our blood keeps the light of terror burning. But I've begun to think that's the lie we tell to keep walking. The real reason we fight is simpler. We're afraid of what silence means. If the guns stopped, if the marching ended, if the ledgers finally closed, what would be left? A galaxy of ghosts, whispering to a god who forgot them. Maybe that's why I still press my palm to my chest twice before every battle. It's not for the Emperor. It's for the dead who might still be listening. It's for Khan, who believed in letters. For Hale, who laughed when it hurt. For Lysa, who wrote names so the galaxy wouldn't forget. It's for me, the man who should have died 100 times and somehow didn't. condemned to remember what everyone else is allowed to lose. The sky tonight is red, not from sunset, but from the manufactura burning beyond the horizon. The air tastes like rust and memory. The new recruits are singing. Their voices shake. The commissar, a new one, of course, recites the creed of unyielding service. His words are clean and practiced. He still believes they mean something. I envy him. When the shells start falling, I don't flinch. I count. 10 in, 10 out. The rhythm never changes. The hum is there again, just under the noise. I close my eyes and see the shape in the sky, the green-gold light, the warmth that said, remember. I whisper back, I do. The explosion takes the words with it. When the dust clears, the trench is gone, the regiment is gone. I am standing in a crater filled with fire and light, and something that hums like a song sung backward. I look down. The medal is gone too. In its place, a small piece of glass, smooth, warm. I hold it up, and inside it, for a heartbeat, I see faces. Khan, Lysa, Hale smiling, unburned, unbroken. Then the glass cools, and it's just a shard again. The vox crackles. A voice. All units status confirm. Victory achieved. I laugh. It sounds like breaking glass. Victory. Always that word. I pick up my lasgun. It's heavy, comforting, familiar. The barrel glows faintly from the heat of the last volley. I sling it over my shoulder and start walking toward the horizon. There will be another war. There's always another war. Maybe this time I'll die. Maybe I already have. As I walk, I hum the rhythm I've carried across a dozen worlds, the sound that lives in the space between shells, the heartbeat that never stops. Somewhere far above, the Astronomicon burns. They say it's the Emperor's light guiding us home. I wonder if he ever looks down and sees what that light costs. Maybe one day he'll wake from his throne, see what we've become, and weep. Or maybe he already did, and the tears became stars. The wind picks up. The plains shimmer with heat. My boots crunch on glass that once was sand, once was stone, once was someone's home. Each step leaves no print. The glass remembers nothing. But I do. And as long as one man remembers, maybe that's enough. Because the truth behind every Imperial victory isn't glory. It isn't faith. It's a single guardsman, standing alone in the dark, whispering a promise the galaxy has forgotten. We held. And maybe, in some far corner of the Emperor's vast and silent dream, that whisper still matters.